Greetings, everyone. Hope all of you are having an absolutely fantastic day. Sven Vincke did an hour-long interview with IGN right after his bombshell speech at the GDC conference, where he revealed that Larian Studios will not be working on Baldur's Gate 4. There was a lot of interesting information revealed in this interview, so I felt like it was worth going through and doing a video on it. Before we get into that though, I do want to state right up front, because I know games journalism gets a ton of flack, sometimes from me. I've certainly had my issues with PC Gamer in the last year, but I think it has to be stated, this interview is fantastic. Kat Bailey and Rebecca Valentine got a lot of really interesting information out of Sven, and I'm really happy that they did this. So big kudos to them, and I'll leave a link in the description if you want to see more. All right, with that being said, first and foremost, he did revisit a little bit his reasonings for why Larian Studios is not going to do BG4. And he talked about how the studio's heart wasn't in it. They did do some beginning work on some new DLC content or potentially looking at a sequel, and it was hard for them. They were pretty much done with the story, felt like they had said everything that they wanted to say, and it was really hard to get in a mindset of trying to do something completely new in that same universe. And so Sven basically made the decision himself after Christmas break to come back to the team and said, we're not going to do this. Instead, we're going to look at doing some of the game ideas that we talked about before we started working on Baldur's Gate 3. And according to him, it was pretty much a sigh of relief all the way around. People were really excited to move on to something different. And it seems like Larian Studios just wants to be able to move on from Baldur's Gate 3. And again, I'll say that it's disappointing, but I'm also happy at the end of the day that they're doing what they want to do. If they had decided to just make it for the money, that probably would have shown. And to be frank, I think the entire team, again, deserves big respect for not just doing what the money probably told them that they should do. In fact, he talked a little bit about how publishers are making terrible decisions that are negatively affecting the industry, and he specifically mentioned NFT games, which is hilarious to me because just last night on stream we were having a conversation about a new NFT game that Ubisoft is working on and how it looks like it's going to be just a gigantic waste of money. And it's decisions like that where publishers decide where to put their resources that has really irritated him, that has caused a negative impact on the industry. And so it's good to see him speaking out about that. All right, but that's kind of old news. So let's get into some of the new interesting things that he talked about in this interview, starting with Astarion originally was going to be a tiefling, and they even included a screenshot of what that was going to look like. They decided to move on from this version of the character, one, because of Neil Newborn's performance, which gave the character a lot of flavor and helped inform what they wanted to do with him, but also because they felt like the tiefling wasn't distinctive enough and it wouldn't really resonate with players. So when I look at the screenshot, honestly, what it reminds me of is Woljif from Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. And I completely agree with them that this character isn't going to fit in with the suave, seductive type of person that Astarion is supposed to be. That being said, though, I am disappointed that they decided to make the character an elf, because I think there's way too much elven representation on the game. And mind you, some of them are half elves, drow, so it's not like they're all one thing. But still, it doesn't feel varied enough at all. And ironically, Sven said that the reason they made Astarion a tiefling originally was to give more race diversity on the team, which they would have had a little bit of. Even though Karlach is a tiefling as well, there would have been only 2 on the squad. But I think the group would have been a little better served if Astarion was one of the other outlier races that you really just don't see all the time in the game. It's really odd that they put so much effort into a character customization for Dragonborn, but you get no Dragonborn character. And I don't think that would have necessarily fit in with Astarion, but just in general, I feel like they could have had more diversity in the group all the way around. But still, it's really cool to see that this was something that they thought about. He also mentioned Ketheric Thorm, that it was originally going to be possible for you to all the way redeem him and make him a party member. So he would have been present in the group when you had discussions in Act 3 with characters like Gortash and Ornn. And that would have been super, super cool. I think out of those three main villains, Ketheric definitely had the strongest storyline and felt the most well developed. And it also really felt like he was someone you should have been able to redeem. You know, it should have been possible to give him some sort of a happy ending. So it would have been nice if we had that option. And he doesn't really clarify what made them decide that it wasn't possible, but I can only assume it was probably the amount of work that would have been involved in trying to rope him into everything that's happening in Act 3 and give him the proper amount of reactivity. So would have been nice, but definitely what we got from him was really, really cool, and he was a standout character. Now, they also talked about some of the changes that were made as far as the maps and places that you could visit. So originally, they were going to make the map smaller, but give you a greater diversity in areas that you could visit. So you were going to be able to visit Candlekeep, which for those of you who played Baldur's Gate 1, you know that that's basically where the series starts. And it's an iconic location for the series. So it would have been really, really cool to experience that. They also talked about allowing the player to visit Vlaakith's palace, which would have been, of course, in Githyanki territory and the Githyanki capital, in fact. And obviously, that would have been really interesting to develop Lae'zel's story. And then finally, they also mentioned that originally they were going to allow you to go to Hell. Now, it's interesting that they say this, and they don't specify where in hell exactly you would have been able to visit. But one of the criticisms I have, and I've definitely heard a lot of other people have about the game, is that Karlach's story feels like one of the weakest among all of the party members, even though she has one of the best personalities. And it feels like there should be some more content to help flesh that out. And I wonder if some of that content was supposed to be in hell. And when they cut that part of the game out, it also cut some of her story out and made her overall experience a little bit weaker. Not sure if that's the case, but it's definitely what immediately came to my mind. In the end, Larian decided to instead go with a format where the areas are much bigger and there's a little bit less variety in what areas you visit. But honestly, I feel like Baldur's Gate 3 is a type of game where you experience a lot of different environments. There was never a time where I was like, man, I'm seeing the same old thing. I wish that they had a little bit more variety in what kind of places you visit. That's not a weakness in the game at all. So all these ideas sound cool, but I don't feel like they bring down the game at all. And then the last thing they talked about in terms of content that didn't make it to the game was originally there was going to be a war college. So in Act 2, if you get to the very edge of the map between the Shadowlands and Baldur's Gate, you can see the Absolute's army, and it's a bunch of huge monsters and creatures, and it's way more people than you will be able to deal with on your own. And eventually, of course, they start marching, and you never actually deal with them directly. You just deal with them by wrapping up your story with the Absolute. Well, originally there was talk about having a section of the game in between Act 2 and Act 3 that would be a war college, and Wyll's dad would be present at that war college, and it would present an opportunity for you to kind of pull together your own army and deal with the Absolute's army that's marching towards the city, or at least slow them down a little bit to give you more time to reach the city and wrap up your story. And as part of this, there was supposed to be a dragon that was basically hopping from tower to tower at this war college, and that just ended up being too much work for the developer. They felt like the animations or the story content that they would have had to implement into the game, there was just no way they were going to be able to do it based upon the scope overall. And so this ended up being cut. And to be honest, I kind of wish at least some of this would have made it into the game, because even though I do feel Wyll's story is very strong, in fact, I feel like he has one of the strongest arcs out of all of the origin characters, I did kind of feel like by the time I finished my playthrough with him, that there should have been more content between him and his dad. Considering all the work you have to do in order to give them a true reunion, there wasn't enough conversations, there wasn't enough interaction between the two of them. I really felt like there should have been more to really hammer home that reunion. And so it sounds like this War College probably would have given me more of the content that I was looking for. But again, they had to do what they had to do to stick within the scope, and Wyll's story is strong even without this. So at the end of the day, obviously cutting this content was the right decision. Now from there, the interview moved a little bit more into game development. And one of the things that Swen talked about was the concept of N+1. And this means that as a game developer, you have to assume all antagonists and protagonists will be killed by the player. So there must be an alternative storytelling mechanic that ensures the player is able to continue with the game even in that situation. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating to see the concept laid out in that manner. There was a part of me always in the back of my mind that felt like the developers obviously had to make their games that way, right? Because there are absolutely some people who prefer to just solo games, kill everything that they possibly can, and just blow things up to the best of their ability. And if you want to try to say that your game provides true freedom, then you have to, at least on some level, allow for that. But it was interesting to see him talk about that as a concept. And he mentioned that there are actually 24 different ways that Shadowheart can give you the Githyanki artifact, depending on things that you do. Because of course, that's absolutely necessary for the story to progress. So really, really cool stuff. And I love the way Larian tries to take the player into account and make sure their game can accommodate different type of play styles. From there, the interview moved into a question about development costs that I thought was fascinating. So basically they asked, considering how much AAA game costs have ballooned, and they mentioned that Baldur's Gate 3 of course cost over $100 million to make, is that sustainable? Will the game industry be able to continue forward with the costs being what they are? And of course, these costs are also part of what's making games more expensive. People complain all the time about these $70 or $80 price tags, and that's just the base game. It doesn't include the deluxe editions and all the other different types that can make the cost rise up to even over $120, $150, depending on what version of the game you're going to buy. And Swen made it absolutely clear he feels like, yes, the development costs are sustainable because the player base is there. And as long as you're satisfying the player and ensuring that you're operating within a certain space where you understand who your player base is and what your limits are, then yes, these costs are sustainable. And it was interesting, he said the philosophy that he has is you take your pre-orders, you multiply it by 10, and then you know your target audience. And then you know, as long as you don't mess up massively between the time you announce those pre-orders and your actual release date, then you should hit your target audience. And he uses this information as a guideline for what risk the studio can and cannot take. In fact, he mentioned during the interview that there was a certain point where he basically cut things and said, this is where we have to stop. We have to just go ahead and finish the game and get it out, because based upon the pre-order numbers and what he felt like was the base audience for the game, he decided that there were certain risks that they would not be able to absorb. And I found it so fascinating because I know there's a lot of players who are strongly against pre-orders. And in fact, even if they really truly believe a game is going to be good, they still won't pre-order it because they've just been burned so many times, or they just don't believe in the business model in general. And so they take a stance of, I'm not going to pre-order your game no matter what. But obviously there are a lot of players who don't believe in that. And in fact, I pre-order games all the time. And so it's interesting to see that he actually uses that as a gauge for how much innovation and how many risks the company is actually able to take based on how well they believe the game is going to do. Really, really interesting stuff. There was also a question about early access, specifically regarding the fact that Act 1 was very, very polished, while Act 2, it was relatively polished with only a few bugs, while Act 3 had a ton of bugs. And so the question became, is early access still a model that you want to move forward with? And Sven said, absolutely. He deeply still believes in early access. He believes that Baldur's Gate 3's story improved significantly due to early access because you were able to see how much of the story was actually resonating with players. And so it helped them to really understand what changes needed to be made. And he also mentioned that some things will change regarding how Larian Studios develops games in order to help ensure that with their next game, they don't have similar issues. So he mentioned specifically that he strongly believes in bottom-up development and that he needs to do a better job of training and teaching people how to do things properly so he doesn't end up having to do it manually and interrupt their ability in order to be able to learn and grow. And in that same vein, he believes more needs to be done to automate the pipeline of work that's coming through. And so one of the things he mentioned is that Larian Studios has added on 15 new concept artists because they were running into the situation where concept art hadn't been finished, and consequently monsters could not be created off of that art, and consequently animators did not have monsters to work with, and they were basically sitting around waiting, which is of course wasted money and wasted production development time. And so it's things like that where he wants to do a better job of creating a pipeline to ensure that there's always work to be done, and to ensure that as much of the dirty work, the uninteresting work, is automated and done in a way that it doesn't distract from people who should be working on much bigger ideas. And they did also talk a little bit about AI. And so he confirmed that Larian Studios does use AI to again automate more of their pipeline process. However, it doesn't replace the creative side of the business for them. And in his opinion, it will never replace the creative side. There's still absolutely a need for human beings to be in certain roles for them to be able to figure out what's an interesting way to approach different things that will really, really engage the player. But there's an opportunity for AI to be used to, again, streamline some of those things that would otherwise take up their time. And then the last thing that they mentioned was the Stadia release, or essentially the Stadia release that didn't happen, and how that impacted the studio. And so Sven mentioned that, obviously, like the rest of us, he felt like the way Stadia was presented was very, very different from what it became upon launch, and that it definitely hurt development of his game, not just in terms of Stadia, but just console release in general, trying to ensure that Baldur's Gate 3 will be ready for both the PC and the consoles all at the same time. And he said in the future, their games will focus on the PC first, and then they'll do a console release afterwards. And he said the reason for that is you have to optimize the game properly for console, and you have specific specs that you have to work with. Whereas with the PC, the specs are much more flexible, and so it's much easier to create a game that's going to work in that PC environment. So they definitely learned a lot from that experience. It put a ton of stress on his developers. They did ask him how did he feel about cloud gaming in general, and he made it clear that his opinion, content is king, and every platform where he can have his game, he wants his game to be there. So looks like they will try to put the game on Switch, and it'll be interesting to see how long that takes or if they'll be successful. But absolutely, he wants his game in as many places as possible. And that's it. That's all the information that I was able to glean out of the interview. Again, I didn't cover literally all the content, so there's a link down below. You can check it out for yourself. You might see a couple of things I didn't bring up that might interest you, but I thought IGN did an absolutely fantastic job, and it was a really cool way to provide a different perspective on not only Baldur's Gate 3, but just game development in general. And I just think every time Sven opens his mouth, It's always fascinating, and he's just a really hard guy not to like and not to respect. So can't wait to see what Larian does next. And honestly, all this coverage of Baldur's Gate 3 makes me want to get back into the game more. So I think we're going to circle back to a playthrough of it soon. There's a ton of content that I still need to do for the game that I never got around to. So this is definitely putting me back in that mood to jump back into the game. But anyway, hope all of you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Join our Discord if you want to get plugged into the community. I appreciate all the support, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.